Well, I'll get us kick-started here. Good afternoon or morning, depending on your time zone. Welcome to the fourth webinar in the Discussing Race and Inequality in the Classroom series. This webinar in particular will focus on COVID's impact on economic well-being. My name is Armida Riojas, and I'm the Director of Outreach for the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. I'm one of over 50 subject matter experts throughout the Federal Reserve System who serve as an education outreach arm of the Fed. Our group in particular, representing audiences within our various regions, provides four main products and services. One, we provide professional development for pre-kinder through college level educators. Two, we provide economic literacy programs for K through 16 students. Three, we partner with like-minded organizations to promote financial capability. And last but not least, we develop classroom-ready resources to support instruction in economics, personal finance, college and career readiness, and related courses. As you see, our collective efforts are aimed at increasing educators' ability to teach economics and personal finance while helping students and the public gain real-life skills to increase their economic literacy and financial acumen. My colleagues and I are pleased you could join us for this important discussion on issues that are currently spanning the globe. In today's program in particular, we will examine current perspectives on COVID's impact on economic well-being, and we'll also touch on economic factors that affect minority populations, offering real-world materials for your economic classroom. We brought national experts together to address these issues today, and you'll have the opportunity to interact with them, so please be prepared with your questions. Before we begin exploring today's topic, let me share our disclaimer that the views and perspectives of today's speakers do not represent the Federal Reserve and represent their own views. So having said that, today's session will include a brief keynote presentation, a panel discussion, and an open forum for your questions. Please submit your questions using the Q&A button, not the chat feature. And having said all of that, I will introduce our presenters for today. Today's keynote speaker is Jeff Larimore, who's the section chief for the Consumer and Community Research section at the Federal Reserve Board, where he oversees the survey of household economics and decision making. It's also known as the SHED survey. And today he will share results from the most recent survey. This survey monitors financial circumstances of US families with an emphasis on how low and middle income individuals are faring. Much of Jeff's research focuses on income inequality, income mobility, and the implications of taxes and public transfers on the distribution of economic resources. His recent research uses IRS tax data to explore income trends in the US since the Great Recession. On our panel, Jeff will be joined by Juliana Horowitz, Associate Director of Research at Pew Research Center, as well as Indivar Dutta-Gupta, who is Co-Executive Director of the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality. We will get to learn more about them at the start of the panel. Today's panel moderator will be my colleague, Mary Suter. Mary is Assistant Vice President and Economic Education Officer at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. So no doubt we are in for a treat. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Larrimore for his presentation.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. One of the highlights of my year is always being able to release these survey findings. So I'm excited to be able to be here today and share the results with you. Before I begin, I do just want to emphasize the disclaimer at the bottom of this slide that everything I say today represents my own views and doesn't necessarily represent the views of the Board of Governors or other members of the staff. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the SHED, this is a survey that the Federal Reserve has conducted each year since 2013. And one of the reasons why I'm always really excited about it is it gives us an opportunity to go out and talk to over 11,000 people each year and really understand aspects of their financial lives. And one of the things that I think is just really nice about this survey is, in addition to being able to look at objective financial outcomes, which you can do in a lot of economic data sets, we also intentionally have built into it using self-assessments along with these objective outcomes. So in addition to understanding things such as whether people have emergency savings, we also do ask questions such as whether they feel like they're doing at least okay financially, or whether they think that their educational decisions have paid off, to be able to then pair these self-assessments along with the more objective outcomes that we see elsewhere. We also ask individuals directly how they make financial decisions. So in addition to asking people things like who you live with, we ask questions like why it is you're living with them, to be able to understand, is this because you're trying to receive financial support and are needing to live with someone else to get by and pay your expenses? Or is it for a reason such as providing care to parents or providing financial support to others? But what's really important and valuable for the shed this year in particular is we have the flexibility to cover new and emerging issues. Every year in this survey, we intentionally build in space to be able to ask new questions on new topics each year. And so this year, of course, a really important aspect of it was how people were faring during COVID-19. So a lot of this flexibility was built in to be able to ask people specifically about their COVID experiences. We also use this flexibility over the course of the year by running some supplemental surveys that I'll talk about as well. So we had surveys in early April, right after the start of the pandemic, and in July, after the distribution of CARES Act funding, that supplemented our main survey, which is in November of each year, or in the fourth quarter of each year, November of 2020, to be able to monitor the effects of the pandemic through the year. And one other thing I want to mention with the survey is, in terms of its structure, is we also have the ability to follow some of the same people over time. So nearly 4,000 people took the survey in 2019, and we could then see how those exact same people were doing a year later after the pandemic began. So I'm going to share some of the key findings that I have and think about from the survey today. But we also have a report that we've just released last month, the Economic Well-Being of U.S. Households in 2020, which has a lot more information, and also the underlying data set is there if you're interested in going and exploring yourself. So all of this is available at the Federal Reserve's website at the link provided here, but you also can find it by doing a search for Federal Reserve Shed, and it should be the first thing that you find. So as I mentioned, the survey has a wide range of topics in it. Here's just an overview of some of the topics that are in the survey. Today, I'm going to be focusing on the ones that are in blue. So I'll start by sharing some results on overall financial well-being during the pandemic, then discuss some of the employment patterns that we see, some of the trends for childcare and K-12 education, and then finally talk about some other family finance aspects, including banking and credit, and people's income and spending patterns. So jumping right into some of the results, for overall economic well-being, some of the key takeaways that I see in this, I think that perhaps unsurprisingly, we do see that there was a sharp increase in the share of people who say that they were worse off financially in November of 2020 compared to when we asked them how they're doing compared to a year earlier. But what we also see, which I think is particularly notable and in many respects some very good news, is that despite these setbacks, most people still say that they're doing at least okay financially. So they may be worse off, but they're still doing okay. But then when we start to dig deeper, that's where we see some of the additional challenges. So we see these growing disparities by education and by race and ethnicity that don't necessarily show up in the top line numbers that much, but are really apparent when we start breaking down the population into specific groups. So this slide shows the question I just mentioned.
Jeff, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. I don't know how I muted myself there, but thank you for fixing that for me. I apologize for that. So this slide shows the share of people who are, and hopefully I haven't been on mute for too long there. This slide shows the share of people who say they're worse off financially than a year ago. So about a quarter of people in 2020 said that they're doing worse off financially than a year ago, with the rest either saying that they're doing about the same or better off financially. And what you can see is that this is up sharply from 2019. So every year we have some people who say they're better off, some people who say they're worse off. But in 2019, 14% of people said they were worse off than a year earlier. In 2020, it was up to 24%. And this is the highest share of people saying they're worse off financially than a year earlier since we started the survey back in, started asking this question back in 2014. But what we also see with this question is that those with less than a high school degree were particularly likely to say that they're worse off than they were a year earlier. So 36% of people, over a third of people with less than a high school degree, said they're worse off than they were 1 year earlier before the pandemic. In a separate question, we also asked people, though, whether they think that they're doing at least okay financially. So despite this increase in setbacks, most people still said they were managing financially. 3/4 of adults said that they were either doing okay financially or they were living comfortably at the end of 2020. But what you can also see here in this figure in the dashed lines where we have the supplemental surveys we ran during the course of the year is that this also did fluctuate through the pandemic. So right after the start of business closures in April, we began to see this downward trend. And we can't necessarily say what it would have been like in May, for example, but once we then got to July, after the distribution of CARES Act funding, we see that it had rebounded. And so it was actually high, but the share of people saying they were at least doing okay financially was higher in July than it was back in 2019, which I think is really an indication of some of the success of the relief measures that were put in place to alleviate the pressures in the pandemic. But then by November, in the bar to the farthest right from our main survey, what we then see is that as CARES Act funding got farther away, financial well-being began to come back down a little bit and was actually back to where it was back in the fall of 2019. But so if you just look at sort of the top line number, it looks like there was a lot of stability. But what we also, though, can see is when you start to look at specific groups within the population, that's somewhat less true. So here I'm taking that exact same question and just breaking it down by education level. And you can see that there's persistent gap in education. People with more education have always said that they're doing better off financially than those with less education. But I want to focus here not on the level difference, but on what's going on with the trends and the trajectory. So for people with at least a bachelor's degree, basically every year of the survey, we're seeing an improvement in their financial well-being. 89% of people with a bachelor's degree in 2020 said they're doing at least okay. And that's actually an improvement from where they were a year earlier. But compare that to people with less than a high school degree. For people with less than a high school degree, you don't see the same upward trajectory in the same way. And in particular, in 2020, we see this big downward movement. It fell by 9 percentage points, the share who said they're doing at least okay financially. And so the gap in financial well-being between people with a bachelor's degree and those with less than a high school degree was actually now the widest it has been since we started the survey back in 2013. I can then look at this exact same question, but doing so, splitting it instead of by education, by race and ethnicity. And here you see that fewer than 2/3 of Black and Hispanic adults said they were doing at least okay financially, compared to 80% of white adults. And this gap too has grown in recent years. So white adults have shown a continued improvement in their financial well-being, including through the pandemic. But among Black and Hispanic adults, we see that it's trending downward. So the past 2 years, we've seen this downtrend in the share of Black and Hispanic adults saying they're doing at least okay. So again, what we see is that the gap in financial well-being by race and ethnicity is now the widest that it's been since we began the survey in 2013. So I'm going to spend a lot of time today talking about differences between white adults, Black adults, and Hispanic adults. But one thing that I do at least want to emphasize here, because I'm really excited about it, is the new feature of the survey in 2020 is that we actually can now separately identify Asian adults as well. So previously they were included among people who said that they had another race or ethnicity besides white, Black, or Hispanic. And so now we're able to separately identify them and share some results on certain questions. So you can see, for example, on this question, that the share of Asian adults who said they're doing at least okay was actually the highest of these 4 groups that we're looking at. So that gives a high-level picture of people's overall financial well-being. So now I want to start thinking about some of the specific aspects of people's financial lives. So what you can see is that layoffs are really concentrated among people who are least prepared for financial setbacks. And one of the reasons for that is that many workers with college degrees worked from home and were able to continue working through the pandemic just from a different location, whereas with people with less education were often unable to. But then we also see, once we look at within layoffs, that there's differences in the likelihood of expecting to return to the same job. So nearly half of laid off workers now didn't expect to return to the same job as of November, with a smaller share of Black and Hispanic laid off workers saying that they had done so. So here's the results for where people are working at the time of the survey in November. So what we see is that 29% of workers worked entirely from home in November at the time of the survey. And this was down from where it was in April, but is still a really large share of people who are working from home. So just for context, back before the pandemic, fewer than 10% of people worked from home. But what's to me is really notable here is actually just the difference in by education levels of where people are working. So among people with a bachelor's degree, 46% said they were working entirely from home. 65% said they were doing at least some other work from home. Among people with a high school degree or less, just 10% were working entirely from home, and just 17% doing any work from home. And remember, this is just among people who actually said that they were working. There's also people who lost a job as a result of an inability to work elsewhere. And so if anything, I think this really understates some of these differences. To me, even more important than where people are working is whether they're able to work and whether they had any disruptions. And this is where we also see some pretty stark differences. So looking at the entire population, 14% of people said that they were laid off at some point in the prior 12 months. So a pretty substantial share of adults were experiencing these financial challenges. But we also really see these differences by education and by race and ethnicity. So in the figure on the right here, you can look at the top is the share of prime age adults, so adults ages 25 to 54, who were laid off at any point in the past year. And you can see people with less than a bachelor's degree, about a fifth of them, a fifth of prime age adults said they were laid off, compared to 12% with a bachelor's degree or more. Similarly, by race and ethnicity, we see this big divide where white and Asian adults were much less likely to say that they were experiencing layoffs than were Black and Hispanic adults. But unfortunately, the difference by race and ethnicity also just doesn't end there. One of the things that is a new question that we added to the survey that I think is really interesting is asking people about their expectations about whether they expect to return to work. So at the start of the pandemic, most people said, I think this is going to be temporary. I'm going to be returning to the same job that I had before. And that's a really good thing because it means that they're maintaining their labor force connections. The setback is likely to be more temporary. At the time of our main survey in late 2020, however, less than a fourth of adults who had been laid off said they returned to their former job, and almost half now said they just don't expect to ever return. We also see that there is this difference by race and ethnicity where 28% of white workers who were laid off had returned to their original job, which is nearly double that seen among Black workers and Hispanic workers. So Black and Hispanic workers are more likely to be laid off, and those who were laid off were less likely to return to the same job, which means it's then going to be a larger disruption and they have to go through the process of actually finding a new job. So the final thing I want to touch on with employment before getting some of the other aspects is people's well-being based on what happened with their employment over the course of the year. And so what we can see is by being able to follow some of the same people from before the survey, from 2019 to 2020, so before the pandemic to after the pandemic, is that laid off workers typically just had smaller financial cushions to begin with. So taking this figure, on the left side is 2019 and the responses that people had based on what then happened to them in the following year. So among people who weren't laid off in the two top bars, the blue circles, you can see that they typically were better off prior to the pandemic beginning. And then over the course of the pandemic, their financial well-being improved. So people who were not laid off and were working from home had a 5 percentage point improvement. 90% of them said they were doing at least okay 8 months into the pandemic. But among people who were laid off, they typically had fewer financial resources to begin with, so they had less cushions to fall back on. And those who were laid off, and particularly those who were not working at the time of our survey in 2020, had this sharp decline in their financial well-being. So they had less resources to begin with, and then this just provided an additional hit to how they were faring and to what their finances actually looked like. So shifting a little bit here now to a separate topic on the survey, I want to talk for a few minutes about what we see for education and childcare. So we know that many parents had disruptions to their child's education or childcare over the course of the year. And these disruptions had numerous different effects. So one is that there were large effects and disruptions on the ability of parents to work. But also we know that this has effects on students as well. So we asked parents whether some questions about how they view the online education and what their perceptions of it are. And we also asked these similar questions to college students. And we see that both K through 12 parents and college students were concerned about the quality of the online education that they or their children were receiving. So first, just taking this broader question of the scale of the childcare and schooling disruptions. I think there should be no surprise to most of the people here that the scale of disruptions were quite substantial. So 68% of parents reported disruptions in childcare or in-person schooling. But what I want to focus on here is what the repercussions of this are on people's ability to work. Obviously, if your child care is disrupted or your child's not going to school, that's going to then now put more of the burden of watching your child during the day on the parents. And so we then ask people whether these disruptions had an effect on their ability to continue to work. And what we see is that it did. 9% of parents, which is about 2% of all adults, said that they were not working because of childcare or schooling disruptions. Another 13% said they were working less because of the childcare or schooling disruptions. And these disruptions predominantly fell on women. You can see in the figure here that among mothers, the share who said that they were not working was far above that for fathers. So 11% of mothers said that they were not working because of the disruptions compared to 6% of fathers. And we also see slightly more mothers and fathers saying that they're working less. Digging even deeper into this, though, not only was it affecting mothers the most, but in particular, it was affecting Black and Hispanic mothers, as well as mothers with less income. So this figure is just among mothers. It's not showing fathers as well. But you can see that among Black mothers, 36% said they're not working less. Among Hispanic mothers, 30% say they're not working less. And compare that to what we see among white mothers. I don't want to minimize the disruptions among white mothers, and I think that 19% saying you're not working less is substantial, but it's far less than we're seeing among Black and Hispanic mothers. And we also see similar gaps by family income as well, where families with incomes of less than $50,000 were more likely to say that there were disruptions because to their ability to work because of these childcare disruptions than we see among higher income families. Now, the other way, in addition to the disruptions to ability to work, the other way, of course, that the disruptions to education have affected families is through the impacts on children's education and the education quality they're receiving. And so when we think about the quality of education people are receiving, we ask them this relative to what it was for in-person education. And so parents were typically viewing online education less favorably than they were in-person education. So 22% of parents said that just 22% of parents thought that their children were learning as much with online education as they were with in-person classes. Just 29% said they felt that their children remained as connected to peers at school as when they were going to classes in person. But I think there's also are some positives here. So we also ask people about whether they feel like their children have access to teachers and whether they feel like they have adequate access to technology for the online courses. And here, most parents, certainly not all, but most parents did say they felt like their children had access to teachers and they felt like they had access to technology. So the relatively low perceptions of the amount that their children are learning in online classes doesn't appear to be due to access to their teachers or the technology, but it seems to be something due to just broader characteristics and broader aspects of the online learning environment. We also then can look at the same questions. This is now, rather than asking parents of K through 12 students, asking college students about their own education. And here we do see that the college students are slightly more positive about the quality of their online education. So 34% said they were learning as much online as with in-person classes, so slightly higher than we saw for K through 12 students, but it still is fewer than said they disagreed and is well less than half. Similarly, they say that they feel less, they're less likely to feel connected to peers at their school. But again, similar to what we see for K through 12 education, they do feel like they have access to teachers and they feel like they have adequate access to technology for online courses. The last piece that I want to touch on with education is, to me, a very natural question was, what is this then doing to achievement gaps and the ability of people to ability of people of different race and ethnicities to continue learning in this environment? And is the achievement gap going to get wider as a result of the shift to online classes? And so, at least somewhat surprisingly to me, but also very comfortingly, is the fact that we actually don't seem to see that there's a substantial racial and ethnic gap in the perceptions of the online learning. So in fact, actually, we see that among Hispanic parents, they were the most likely to say if they think their child was learning as much with online education as they were with in-person classes. And this is true both for parents of K through 12 students as well as for college students. And I think that this is kind of an interesting, to me, this is a very interesting result. But I also want to at least temper this a little bit, because these questions are specifically asking about the relative quality of online education to the in-person classes. So I think that this should not be interpreted, or at least I don't interpret this to say that the quality of online education is identical for people of all different races and ethnicities, or that Hispanic children are actually having the highest quality of online education. Instead, what this is saying is that relative to the in-person classes, where we know that there's been substantial disparities, the online education, there doesn't seem to be a larger drop-off for Black and Hispanic children in particular than for white children. Just that the online education is providing a comparable gap to what existed with in-person education. The other thing that I at least want to mention here as well is that we're able to look at whether or not people are thinking that the quality of the education is lower online, but not how much lower. So it is also possible within this that we may have similar shares of people of different races and ethnicities saying that the quality has declined, but that the amount that the quality has declined could still be different among children of different races and ethnicities. So the final topic that I want to touch on is some questions we have regarding family finances. So it's taking a step back and moving more towards some of these objective outcomes. So I started with the self-assessed measures, but now talking a little bit about some of these objective outcomes. And what we see is that laid off Black and Hispanic workers were particularly likely to fall behind on their bills. They also are most likely to have increased outstanding credit card debt. And then taking the sort of the other side, so I think that sort of the credit cards and the ability to pay bills is some of these negative repercussions. One of the potential positives in the during the past year is the fact that with interest rates particularly low, there actually is an opportunity for families to reduce their expenses without reducing their consumption through a refinance to a lower interest rate. But here what we see is that mortgage refinances, while they were common, they were much more common among high income families. So even there, there's the potential to be increasing inequalities as a result of who is taking advantage of these mortgage refinances. So here's the results that we have for whether people are able to pay their current month's bills. So to me, this is just a very important fundamental question of financial well-being. Just can you actually pay the bills that you have in the current months? And what we see is that 16% of adults said that they were not able to pay their current month's bills in full. But the likelihood of being unable to pay your current month's bills in full varies dramatically, both based on whether you're laid off, but also based on race and ethnicity. So laid off workers, perhaps unsurprisingly, were much more likely to say they faced difficulty paying bills than those who weren't laid off. But look at the difference by race and ethnicity within that. Over half of Black workers who were laid off said that they couldn't pay their current month's bills in full. That's over twice what we see among laid off white workers. In fact, laid off white workers, so 23% of them said they couldn't pay their current month's bills in full. That's about the same as, or it's higher than the share of laid off Hispanic workers, or sorry, it's higher than the share of Hispanic workers who were not laid off, who couldn't pay their current month's bills in full. And it's almost as high as the share of Black workers who weren't laid off, they couldn't pay their current month's bills. So frequently, Black and Hispanic workers were coming into the pandemic with fewer resources. We know that there's a big racial and ethnic wealth gap and income gap. And as a result, they're less likely to have resources to be able to fall back on in the event of a layoff. And we then end up with these pretty stark racial and ethnic disparities in ability to just meet their fundamental ability to pay their current month's bills, even within those who had similar employment outcomes. We also can look at these patterns by credit card debt. So it's sort of looking at this the exact same way by race and ethnicity within the employment outcomes, whether people experienced a layoff or not. And so one way that people are able to maintain their spending, even if in the event of a financial setback, is by turning to credit cards as a way to smooth their consumption, to be able to borrow and weather that financial shock. And so we see that there are these increases in balances on credit cards are much more frequent among people who were laid off. But here again, we see this big racial and ethnic gap where Black and Hispanic adults with a credit card were much more likely to have increased their balance than were white workers, and especially if they were laid off in the past year. So then the final piece of family finances, which I think is a real indication of some of the ways that we can end up with these sort of widening inequality gaps, is this idea of what's going on with mortgage refinances. So in the past year, again, interest rates have been particularly low. So it is this opportunity to lower monthly bills, even if you're purchasing basically the exact same things every month. And we saw that 1/5 of homeowners with a mortgage refinanced within the past year. But the figure here is showing the likelihood of refinancing. This is all among homeowners based on what their income level is. So among high-income homeowners, we're much more likely to see refinances. So about a quarter of homeowners making over $100,000 refinanced in the past year, which is about twice that for families where they're making under $50,000. We also see here that there's a racial and ethnic gap. So Black homeowners are much less likely to refinance. 13% of Black homeowners refinanced compared to at least 20% among each of the other races and ethnicities that we look at. And so I think that this is just kind of one more way that we can be ending up with some of these broader inequalities that can then persist over time and perpetuate racial and ethnic wealth gaps. And I also want to just mention, this is only among homeowners. So as I'm talking about sort of these gaps that we're seeing, we also know that there's a racial and ethnic gap in the likelihood of owning a home, and renters also aren't able to take advantage of these refinances. So I think that can then be exacerbating this even more. So I know that I covered a lot of ground today, and I'm sort of really looking forward to the conversation and the discussion about all of this. But what are some of the sort of my main takeaways here? So I think that as a kind of a top line result, I think that we do see this general stability in finances, given the magnitude of the disruptions that we had. But then I really want to emphasize, like, there's one takeaway that I have that I would take from all of this. It's the importance of digging deeper, and that the aggregates alone don't tell the whole story. That while we have general stability in the averages, once we then look farther, we see these underlying challenges. So we have these gaps in financial well-being across education levels, by race and ethnicity. And we also have the differential rates of layoffs and employment experiences by race and ethnicity. And the experiences of those who were laid off was just so much different than those who remained employed. And I think that if you just look at the top level numbers, it's very easy to end up missing that. So I think that that's, to me, is kind of the main thing that I take away from this is, yes, in the aggregate, we have a lot of positives, but once we start to peel away at it and look a little bit deeper, that's where we see some of these challenges. And I think it's really important to be paying attention to those as well. So I'll stop there, and we'll really look forward to the conversation and discussion.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for your comments. I think I'll start by asking, the survey uses the term doing at least okay financially, and people are self-reporting. So within the survey, are they given guidance about what that means or a definition of what that means?
So they're not given a definition of what that means, and that's actually intentional. We have lots of measures in this survey of financial well-being. So things such as, are you able to pay your bills? Do you have emergency savings? Things like that. But we really wanted to be able to let people tell us what they're thinking about their financial lives rather than trying to define it for them. And we're able to then look at this measure and correlate it with a whole wide range of financial outcomes. And I mean, it is correlated with the things that you would expect, that we see that people who can't pay their monthly bills are much less likely to tell us that they're doing at least okay financially. But because there's so many different aspects that go into people's individual finances, we didn't want to just sort of try to pick one of those and say, this is what it means to be doing okay. We thought it was going to be much more fruitful to let them tell us that.
Okay, thank you. We had a couple questions about demographics in the survey. So first, is there a breakdown of urban, suburban, rural respondents to the survey?
Not quite to that full level, but we do have sort of, whether you're in a metropolitan area broadly compared to whether you're in a more rural area. And we've kind of seen like a persistent gap where people in more rural areas are frequently telling us that they have slightly lower financial well-being, but we don't see major trends in that over the past year at least. So we have at least some information there. There's more in the report as well. So I think I'll use this as an opportunity to plug the fact that the report is out there as well. But we're not seeing major trends in that, for example, the way that we are with by education level, for example.
Okay, thank you. One of our participants asked for some clarification about who responds. Are these people from all over the United States responding to your survey?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad that somebody asked that. Yes, this is a nationally representative survey. So we have respondents from all across the country, and the survey research firm that we work with works very hard to make sure that we're getting a representative pool of respondents. So everything that I shared today should be interpreted as reflecting the broad perspective from across the United States, and not just that from within a specific state or specific region, for example.
Okay, thank you. And then a related question on the education, perceptions of education and so forth. Do you know if you have public schools, charter schools, private, parochial schools represented there? Do you have any breakdown about that?
We do know whether it's a public or private school. That's as far as our breakdown goes.
Okay.
I don't have off the top of my head any differences in perceptions by whether it's a public or private school. I believe that there were not major differences, which is why I'm not having that off the top of my head. Is that there was nothing particularly notable there in terms of that difference, but we do know that. I just don't know the exact details off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you. So we had a question here. Are people, based on what you're looking at in the survey, do you have any indication about whether people are choosing not to return to work? Are jobs no longer available? We've read that people are choosing to take the opportunity to go back and get training or change jobs. Do you have any insights about that?
Yeah, so this is a case where I'm actually really looking forward to this year's survey, because our survey was conducted in the fall of 2020. And at the point that we were conducting the survey, I think that the concerns that we had, and I think that the general discussions, was much more a concern about whether jobs exist and whether people are able to, they have a job to return to. And it was really this spring that we started to have more of these discussions of, are people actually wanting to go back to work? And so I think that one of the things that I'm really hoping to be able to incorporate into our survey this year is more of those questions about whether people want to be able to go back to work, and what some of their thought processes are if they're saying they don't want to. I think that within that, there's I at least want to sort of note that among people who may not want to go back to work, there's a wide range of reasons why they may not go back to work. I think that sometimes there's this perception of people don't want to go back to work because they're lazy. And I don't think that that's necessarily accurate, because there's things such as vaccine availability, and whether they've been vaccinated, whether they're comfortable with, even if they are vaccinated, are they comfortable being around people in a non-socially distant environment? There's concerns about childcare, as I mentioned. And so all of those would be contributing to this idea of people not wanting to go back to work. But that's a little bit different than this idea of, well, I just don't want to go back to work because I'd rather not be working. It's because there are these other factors that are at play there.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. I think that gives us a lot to think about in relation to that question. The survey shows substantial disparities by race and ethnicity during the pandemic. How much of this do you see as new, and to what extent is a reflection of the differences that predated the pandemic?
Yeah, so I think that unfortunately we know that there have been very long-standing and persistent disparities by race and ethnicity. We see that going back decades in terms of employment, in terms of income, in terms of wealth. So there are a lot of these disparities have existed for a long time. I think that what to me stands out with our survey is that we are seeing some evidence. What I would hope to see is that these gaps would be closing every year. And we're seeing some evidence that these gaps are actually widening as a result of the financial conditions around the pandemic. So I think that I would say these disparities are certainly longstanding, but the pandemic seems to be making them worse.
This is a question that about the issues of systemic racism that seem to be evident in the survey, and the perpetuation of the achievement gap, and how that is probably exacerbating some of those problems. And the participant is wondering, how does the Fed see itself? What is it that the Fed might be able to do relative to the results of this survey? What kinds of policies and things might be relevant from the Fed?
Yeah, so I think that this is one where I have to, unfortunately, I have to say I can't speak for the Fed,
Right.
And
Exactly.
I'm going to have to sidestep this a little bit. I think that at least from where I'm sitting at the Fed, I view part of the role of surveys such as this is to be able to really give good information on what some of these disparities are looking like, understanding these these inequities that exist, and then being able to help policymakers at the Fed and elsewhere be able to think about what the appropriate policy responses are. But that's really all for the policymakers to decide what those appropriate policies are, and so I don't want to get ahead of them in terms of what the right responses are then going to be.
So in closing, I'd like to extend our thanks to our keynote speaker and our panelists for sharing their expertise and insight on this relevant and timely topic. I will tell you, I personally took a lot from this conversation. Knowledge is power, so thank you again so much for that. I also definitely would like to thank Mary for moderating and guiding our discussion today. Although the past school year was different from any other, no doubt, we hope you received information and tools today that will be of value. We are optimistic that this discussion will spark inclusive ideas and practices. And even though the teaching and learning environments we faced during the past school year may have been hard to define, we believe illustrations heard today can help move towards real and sustainable change in the racial and gender economic divide. As our speakers indicated in their closing remarks, armed with these examples, each of us can strive to cultivate more diverse and inclusive environments for our students, our schools, and our communities. So now a moment for a quick plug. This fall, we will introduce a new webinar series focused on teaching economics in changing times, and will include a wide array of economic, personal finance, and college and career readiness topics. We will be sharing a link to an event survey in a moment within the chat, as well as on a slide, and we'd love your feedback. This is your chance to provide input, so please provide your feedback using the link that will be available to you in a minute or so. Also, another event that we believe will be of particular interest to our educators is the Educator Town Hall with the Fed Chair. This is an event we do biannually, and it's scheduled to occur Monday, August the 2nd at 4 p.m. Eastern. You'll get a chance to hear directly from Fed Chair Jerome Powell as a kickoff to the school year. You'll have an opportunity to pre-submit questions, and who knows, you may even be selected to ask your question live, so don't miss out on this opportunity. Registration's already open, and that's available on the slide as well. And you can find this information not only here on these slides, but you can find them as well on federalreserveeducation.org. It's the website where you can find all our curriculum resources produced throughout the Fed system, as well as a recording of part of today's program. You can definitely also find information on your local Fed, as well as information on the contacts you can reach out for questions and assistance. And so again, I thank you for joining us today and for participating in our discussion. Have a great summer.